The last thing he remembered was the headlights on the highway in Iowa. Now, hungry men with pitchforks stand over him, arguing whether to bury him right away or wait until he dies on his own. A stranger from the mud. An extra mouth to feed in a village where, after winter, there isn't enough food to go around. He has one night to give them a reason not to kill him. The cold hits his lungs like a fist. Daniel Carter opens his eyes. Above him is the low, gray March sky. Beneath his back is not asphalt, but living, clay-rich earth. The smell of manure, wet wool, and smoke from damp firewood stings his nose. He knows this smell. He smelled it in villages near Kampala, in the mountains of Nepal, at his grandmother's in Nebraska when he was a boy. It's the smell of a place where people live hand to mouth. His fingers clench a clump of earth on their own. Sour. Off the top of his head, the pH is around 5 or 8. Depleted. People are talking overhead. The language is foreign, but for some reason, the words fit into his head like his own. A woman says that someone has dumped a dying person here again. A man replies that they should bury him and not bother with it. Daniel props himself up on his elbow. The world is spinning. His frozen muscles won't obey him. Before him stands a girl of about 10 in a burlap rag. Huge, frightened eyes, swollen gums, scurvy, late stage. He's seen it hundreds of times in textbooks and dozens of times in real life. Next to her is a woman in her 40s, dark spots on her arms and neck, pellagra, niacin deficiency, classic starvation on a grain-based diet lacking legumes and vegetables. Daniel sits down. His head is buzzing. The last thing he remembers is I-80, headlights, the smell of coffee from the cup holder, and darkness, and now dirt, cold, hungry people in unbleached fabric. He looks at his hands, the same ones, calluses from lab work, a scar on his thumb from pruning shears. So it's him, not someone else's body, not a rebirth, just Daniel Carter, 34 years old, associate professor of sustainable agriculture, in the middle of a place that shouldn't exist. A large man strides toward him, hands as heavy as shovels, a leather apron scorched by sparks, a blacksmith. Daniel identifies the profession before he has time to think. The blacksmith orders his daughter to step back. The girl with scurvy doesn't move. Behind the blacksmith are 3 more, 2 with pitchforks and an old man with a stick. They look at Daniel as if he were a dead dog by the roadside, still alive or already dead. Is it worth wasting time? Daniel stands. His legs are unsteady. He's in his own clothes, jeans, a fleece jacket, boots from a store in Des Moines. Everything is soaked through. The blacksmith stares at these clothes and doesn't understand what he's seeing. The fabric is too smooth. The seams are too fine. The zipper on the jacket glints with metal, and one of the men with a pitchfork flinches back. Daniel says he's not dangerous. His voice comes out hoarse and foreign, but the words are in their language. He doesn't understand how himself. He thinks in English, but something else comes out of his mouth. The blacksmith squints. He asks where he's from. Daniel looks around. The soggy field stretches to the horizon. Gray earth, patches of snow in the furrows. In the distance, low log houses with thatched roofs. He counts 80 yards. Some of the houses stand with collapsed roofs, abandoned. There are far too few people moving between the houses for so many yards. Daniel turns to the blacksmith and tells the truth, that he doesn't know where he's from or how he got here. The woman shrugs. She says they already have 8 mouths to feed and nothing to feed them with. The man with the pitchfork spits and demands they chase the stranger away before he brings disease. And then a girl with swollen gums says quietly and stubbornly that he doesn't look sick. Sick people don't get up on their own and don't speak in a steady voice. The blacksmith is silent. Then he mutters that he should lie in the barn until morning, and in the morning they'll figure it out. The barn is an outbuilding attached to the smithy, warm from the cooling forge, straw in the corner. Daniel sits down and stares into the darkness. His hands are shaking, not from the cold, from the realization. He died on the highway in Iowa. Or maybe he didn't. He doesn't know. But he knows something else. The girl needs ascorbic acid, vitamin C, rose hips, pine needles, sauerkraut, anything that retains acid. The woman needs niacin, legumes, meat, liver. He knows what's wrong with the field beyond the wall. He knows why the soil is acidic and how to fix it. 200 years of agronomic science lie in his head like a library to which no one in this world has access. Only these people don't know him. They don't trust him, and they're right. To them, he's a wet stranger from the mud. In the morning, they'll drive him out, or kill him, or simply withhold food and wait for him to leave on his own. He needs to give them one reason not to do that, a small one, a concrete one. Morning arrives gray and wet. Daniel hasn't slept. He listened all night to the blacksmith hammering away behind the wall. Then a rooster crowed. He got up. His body ached as if he'd been run through a threshing machine. A girl stood by the barn with a bowl. Gray barley porridge, watery, bland. He ate it all. His body demanded calories. The girl said her name was Lena. Daniel says his name, and she comes out with something like Danelle. That'll do. He asks who's in charge here. Lena points to the house in the center. The village elder, Halder. Daniel heads there. Lena follows like a shadow, 3 steps behind. People on the street turn to look. They say nothing. He feels their stares like pressure. In a village where food is scarce after winter, a stranger is not a guest. He's just another mouth to feed. Halder is about 55, thin, wiry, the eyes of a man who has buried too many. He sits on a bench whittling a stick. He doesn't get up. Daniel asks for neither food nor shelter. He asks if he can take a look at the communal granary. Halder freezes, knife in hand. His eyes harden. The granary is the village's life and death in one place. A stranger has no business there. Daniel says he can see when people are sick, that the girl who brought him porridge has swollen gums, and in a month her teeth will start falling out. Halder glances at Lena. He asks how he knows about her gums. Daniel replies that he knows how to work the land and what grows on it. If they show him the granary, he'll tell them whether the grain will survive until sowing or rot. Halder is silent for a long time. Then he stands up. Let's go. The granary is on the edge of the village. The door is heavy. Halder pulls the bolt. Inside, it's dark and smells of musty grain. The bins along the walls are almost empty. They're only a third full. This is Grayford's entire seed stock, all the village can count on come spring. Daniel scoops up a handful of grain, brings it to his face, runs his fingers through it. Among the light-colored rye grains, there are dark ones, twisted, with a purple sheen. Ergot, a fungus that infects the ears in wet years. In medieval Europe, it was called St. Anthony's fire. Convulsions, hallucinations, gangrene. Entire villages were poisoned by it at once. Daniel turns to Halder and shows him the dark grains in his palm. It's poison. Sow this along with the healthy grain, and people will be sick all year. Children will start seeing things that aren't there. They'll scream at night. Some will die. Halder turns pale. Daniel points to the far corner. The wall is damp there, dark spots on the logs. The grain in the chest nearby has already gone damp. It'll rot by May. Move the chests to the chimney and line the bottom with straw, and the grain will last until fall. Halder looks at the dark grains, then at the wet wall, then back at the grains. He turns to the door and calls for his son. A boy of about 17 stands in the doorway. Halder orders him to bring a torch. He turns to Daniel and utters a single word. Work. Daniel works until nightfall. Then another day. He sits on the floor and sifts through the grain, handful by handful. The healthy ones in one pile, the infected ones in another. His back aches. His eyes hurt from the dim light, but he sifts through it all. 12% is infected with ergot. Another 8% is ruined by dampness and mold. A fifth of the seed stock is a write-off. If they'd planted it all as is, they would have lost far more. The infected grain would have poisoned both the soil and the healthy ears of grain nearby. On the second evening, Halder meets him by the barn. He looks at the pile of rejected grain, then at Daniel. He says Daniel can stay in the shed by the smithy, and that tomorrow they'll give him a proper meal instead of watery porridge. It's not much, but it's a start. By the shed, Lena asks how he found out about the dark kernels. Daniel thinks for a second. He says his father taught him. It's a lie. His father grew corn in Iowa and had never seen ergot in his life. But the truth in this world would sound like madness, and the lie about his father is understandable and comforting. Lena nods. She leaves. Daniel collapses onto the straw, and for the first time in 2 days closes his eyes. Not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. He doesn't yet know the name of this world. He doesn't know why he's here. He doesn't know if he'll ever return. But he knows one thing. This land is sick. These people are starving, and he knows how to heal it. The only question is whether they will give him the time. On the third day, Daniel walked the entire length of Grayford for the first time. 78 courtyards. He counted them. 63 of them were inhabited. The rest stood with boarded-up doors or no doors at all. Some courtyards had no owners, only old women with children. The men had gone to work for the neighboring baron or had died last winter. Daniel walked down the single street and looked around. The agronomist's eyes saw what the locals didn't see because they were used to it. The vegetable gardens by the courtyards were tiny. Turnips and cabbage in the same spot year after year. Exhausted soil, pale sprouts, not a single legume. No peas, no lentils, no beans. That means there's almost no protein in their diet. That means the children grow up weak and get sick at the slightest breeze. The fields beyond the village were even worse. Daniel reached them by noon. 3 large communal fields, all planted with barley. Every year, the same crop, in the same spot. A monoculture on depleted acidic soil. Classic medieval fallow farming. 1 year you sow, 1 year you rest. And in lean years, you sow even during the fallow year because there's nothing to eat. And the soil degrades even faster. The southern field was waterlogged. Where the melted snow ran down the gentle slope, water pooled in puddles, and the soil was not gray but black, peaty, acidic. With proper drainage, it would be the best field in the area. Now it was a swamp where sedge grew, with a little stunted barley at the edges. Daniel crouched down. He picked up a clump of soil. He crumbled it between his fingers. He sniffed it. Dense, silted, but plenty of organic matter. If the water were drained and the soil deacidified with ash, in 2 years you could grow top-notch crops here. He stood up and walked on. Near the eastern field, he found something else. A patch of land that hadn't been plowed in a long time, overgrown with wild grass. Among the grass, he saw clover. Wild, white clover. His heart began to beat faster. Clover is a legume. Clover fixes nitrogen from the air through a symbiosis with bacteria in its roots. Clover is free fertilizer that grows right under your feet and that no one in this world considers useful. He picked a bunch and tucked it into his shirt. That evening, Daniel sat in the shed and thought. He had no paper, no pencil. He took a charred stick from the blacksmith's forge and began to draw on a flat stone. A map of the Grayford fields. 3 fields, vegetable gardens, a marshy patch, an abandoned wasteland with clover. Lena came in with dinner, a bowl of porridge, thicker this time, with a piece of boiled turnip. She saw the drawing on the stone and sat down beside him. She asked what it was. Daniel explained. He showed her which field was which. Lena nodded. She had known these fields since childhood. Daniel asked why they didn't plant the southern field. Lena said the soil there was rotten. Water always stood there. 10 years ago, they tried to plant it, and everything drowned. They haven't touched it since. Daniel asked why they didn't dig a ditch to let the water drain away. Lena looked at him blankly. He understood. To her, it was like asking why you wouldn't move a mountain. The water stands there because the soil is rotten. The soil is rotten because that's just the way it is. It never occurred to anyone that they could simply divert the water. Daniel changed the subject. He asked if there were any peas in the village. Lena said there used to be peas, They stopped planting them about 5 years ago. There were no seeds left. They'd eaten them all during a famine-stricken winter. That was a blow. Without legumes, he couldn't start a crop rotation. Without crop rotation, the land would continue to die. He needed pea seeds. He asked if there were merchants who passed through the village. Lena said sometimes, once every 2 or 3 months. Merchants from the south brought salt and iron, but you had to pay for peas, and the village had nothing to pay with. Daniel nodded. He set down his stick. He looked at Lena. She was sitting nearby, waiting, patiently, without impatience, like someone used to waiting. He asked how old she was. She said 19. He nearly choked. She looked 14, small, skinny. Hunger robs people of their age. On the morning of the 4th day, Daniel went to see Halder. The village elder was having breakfast, the same porridge, the same turnip. Daniel sat down across from him and spoke. He said that the fields of Greyford were dying. He said that if they kept planting barley in the same spot every year, in 3 years the harvest would drop to a single ear or two, and the village would die out. Halder listened in silence. His face remained unchanged. Daniel continued. He said he knew a way to double the harvest in 2 seasons. But to do that, 3 things needed to be done. First, divide the fields into 4 parts and plant something different in each. 1 year barley, 1 year peas or another legume, 1 year turnips, 1 year nothing. Let the land rest under clover. Second, dig a ditch from the southern field to the stream to drain the water. And third, start making compost. Halder asked what compost was. Daniel explained. Gather manure, straw, food scraps, and leaves into one pile. Don't scatter it fresh across the field like they do now, but let it rot together over the summer. By fall, you'll have a black, crumbly mass that will fertilize the soil 10 times better than fresh manure. Halder frowned. He said they'd always thrown manure right onto the field. That's how their grandfathers did it, and their grandfathers' grandfathers. Daniel didn't argue. He said that the grandfathers were smart people and did the best they could, but he knew a way to do it even better, and he proposed a test. 1 plot the old way, 1 the new way. They'd compare them in the fall. Whoever yields more grain is right. Halder thought for a long time. Then he said there was no one to dig the trench. There weren't enough men. Everyone's busy. Daniel said he'd dig it himself. All he needed was a shovel. Halder looked at his hands. They weren't a farmer's hands. Slender fingers, calluses not from a shovel, but from delicate work. Halder smiled for the first time since they'd met. He said, "All right, we'll give you a shovel. Let's see how long you last." Daniel took the shovel and headed toward the southern field. Lena followed behind him again. He marked out the line of the future ditch, from the lowest point of the marshy area to the stream that flowed 200 paces to the east. The elevation difference was small but sufficient. The water would flow on its own if he dug to a depth of 2 elbows and with the right slope. He plunged the shovel into the ground. The soil was heavy, wet. Every stroke was a struggle. An hour later, his shoulders were burning. 2 hours later, his palms were covered in blisters. 3 hours later, he had dug 6 paces of the trench. Given the required length of 200 paces, it was pitiful. He didn't stop. By evening, he had dug 20 paces. His hands were covered in blood. His back wouldn't straighten. Lena brought him some water. Then she left. Then she returned with a rag and silently bandaged his palms. On the morning of the 5th day, Daniel could barely stand. His whole body was screaming. He stepped out of the shed and saw 2 men by the trench, young guys. One was Halder's son, that very same Keelan whom the village elder had sent to fetch kindling. The second was a stranger. They were digging, in silence, without looking at Daniel, just digging. Daniel picked up a shovel and stood beside them. He dug in silence. By noon, a 3rd man approached, an old man with a hunched back. He, too, silently picked up a shovel. By evening on the 5th day, the ditch had grown to 50 paces. No one said a word to Daniel. No one asked why. They simply saw that the stranger was digging until he bled, and decided that if a man worked like that, maybe he wasn't lying. In this world, words were worth nothing. Work was worth something. That evening, Ansgar came to the barn, the blacksmith. Lena's father. He hadn't spoken to Daniel since the first day. He simply tolerated his presence. Now he brought a piece of smoked meat. He placed it on the bench. He said one word, "Eat," and he left. Daniel ate the meat. Salty, tough, the best thing he'd ever eaten in his life. On the 6th day, 2 more men came to the ditch. On the 7th, 5. 10 days later, the ditch was ready. 200 paces long, 2 cubits deep, the right slope. When the last shovelful of earth was thrown out, water slowly began to flow along the bottom. A thin trickle, muddy. It flowed toward the stream. The southern field began to dry out. Daniel stood knee-deep in mud and watched the water flow away. 10 men with shovels stood nearby. They were watching too. One of them said, "Well, it works." April arrived with a cold wind and occasional rain. The snow had almost melted. The earth was wet and heavy, but already alive. Daniel could feel it with his fingers as he crouched at the edge of the field and squeezed clumps in his palms. The soil was waking up. It was sick and exhausted, but it was waking up. Now he needed compost. He chose a spot behind the farthest yard by the eastern field, a flat area sheltered from the wind by the wall of an old abandoned house. He went to Halder and asked permission to use the spot. Halder asked why. Daniel explained it again, patiently, slowly. Manure thrown onto the field while fresh does not nourish the soil but burns the roots. Raw manure is poison to young sprouts. But if you gather the manure together with straw and food scraps, pile it up, water it, and turn it over every 2 weeks, then in 3 months you'll have black soil. Rich, soft, the kind that nourishes rather than kills. Halder listened with the expression of a man watching a magician. He doesn't believe it but wants to see what happens. He said, "Go ahead." Daniel began gathering manure. It was dirty work. Daniel Carter, an associate professor at Iowa State University, walked through the yards and collected cow manure in a wheelbarrow. Lena helped. She didn't complain. She didn't grimace. She worked silently and methodically. Daniel noticed that she never complained at all. It wasn't stoicism. It was an upbringing in poverty. When your whole life is hard, you don't notice the hardship. On the 3rd day of collecting manure, a woman approached them. She was stout, short, with dark blonde bangs and hands covered in flour. She watched as Daniel layered the manure and straw and watered it down. She asked what this madness was. Daniel explained. The woman said he was crazy. Then she asked if they needed food scraps from the bakery, trimmings, burnt pieces of dough. Daniel said they were very much needed. The woman nodded and left. That evening, a bucket of scraps appeared by the compost pile. It was Maeve, a widow, a village baker. Daniel learned her name later from Lena. Lena said that Maeve fed half the village and took nothing for it because she considered it her duty. Daniel thought that in any world, in any era, there are people like that, who shoulder everything themselves and ask for no help. The compost pile grew. A week later, it was 10 paces long and waist-high. Every morning, Daniel checked the temperature with his hand. He stuck his palm into the middle of the pile. Warm. The process was underway. The bacteria were working. Of course, he couldn't tell the locals the word bacteria. He said that tiny, invisible creatures lived inside the pile, eating the manure and turning it into good soil. They needed warmth, water, and air. That's why the pile had to be watered and turned. Father Bren heard this, the local priest, a thin man with sunken cheeks and burning eyes. He stood 10 paces away and listened. Then he approached and asked what kind of invisible creatures they were. Daniel sensed danger. He said it was simply a work of nature. Just as fire turns wood to ash, so these creatures turn manure into soil. Bren looked at him for a long time. Then he said that God created nature, and only God decides what turns into what, and anyone who claims otherwise is speaking heresy. And he left. Lena said quietly that they had to be careful with Bren, that he had already written complaints to the city twice about people who, in his opinion, were practicing witchcraft. A man from a neighboring village had been burned at the stake 3 years ago for making an ointment for burns. Daniel remembered. But he couldn't stop. Time wouldn't wait. In 2 weeks, it was time to sow. He focused on what he could do right now. Pea seeds. Without them, the whole plan would fall apart. He couldn't start crop rotation without legumes. He couldn't restore nitrogen to the soil. He couldn't provide the people with the protein they so desperately lacked. And then something happened that Daniel would have called luck if he believed in luck. On the 16th day of his life in Grayford, a traveling merchant passed through the village. An old man with a donkey loaded with sacks. He was carrying salt from the southern mines. Daniel went out to meet him. He asked if he had any seeds. The merchant looked at him suspiciously. He said he had a few pea seeds, but they were expensive. A sack cost 2 silver coins. Daniel didn't have a single coin. He thought for a moment. Then he took the watch off his wrist, a mechanical one, his father's. The only thing from his past life that had any value here. Glass, metal, a mechanism. The merchant stared at the watch as if it were a fallen star. He turned it over in his hands. He listened to the ticking. He looked at the hands. He asked what it was. Daniel said it was a device that showed the time. The merchant didn't understand how a small metal thing could show the time, but the shine of the case and the strange workings of the mechanism convinced him that the thing was expensive. He gave him 2 sacks of pea seeds and a sack of turnip seeds to boot. Daniel watched as the merchant walked down the road with his watch on his wrist. The last piece of Iowa disappeared around the bend. Now he had nothing left from his old world except his knowledge and the sacks of seeds. Daniel began preparing the fields. He chose 3 households, more precisely, 3 owners who were willing to take a risk. The first was Halder. The village elder took the risk not out of trust, but out of calculation. If it worked, he would be the first. The second was Ansgar. The blacksmith agreed without a word. Lena had asked him to. That was enough. The third was an old man named Torvald, 70 years old, half blind. He had a tiny field behind his house and had nothing to lose. He said that if he died this winter, at least he would die having tried something new. Daniel divided each plot in half. On one half, they sowed as usual, barley, pure. On the other, he planted peas interspersed with barley. He explained why. Peas capture an invisible force from the air that nourishes the soil. Barley grows better next to peas because the peas share this energy through their roots. Halder listened with a stony face. Torvald snorted and said that peas catch the spirits of the air. Nice. Daniel smiled. Nitrogen fixation had become theology. But if it works, what does it matter what it's called? He sowed by hand. He was used to seeders, to tractors, to GPS-mapped fields. And here, hands and a furrow. A handful of seeds. A step. A handful. A step. Wind in his face. Mud on his knees. It was ancient and simple and, for some reason, right. As if everything he had studied all those years had led him to this moment. To a handful of peas in a wet palm on a stranger's field in a stranger's world. At the same time, he took on another task. The children. 2 children in the village had severe scurvy. A boy of about 7, the son of one of the widows, and a 5-year-old, the daughter of a man who had been helping to dig a ditch. Both had swollen, bleeding gums. The boy had already started losing his teeth. Daniel needed vitamin C, and he needed it immediately. He walked around the outskirts of the village. He found what he was looking for after a half-hour walk, a thicket of wild rose hips on the southern slope of the hill. Last year's berries were still hanging on the branches, dry, shriveled, but they still contained vitamin C, lots of it. Rose hips are one of the richest natural sources. He gathered as many as he could carry, brought them back to the village, brewed them in hot water. The result was a sour, dark drink. He gave it to the children. He explained to the mothers that they needed to drink it every day without fail. In a week, the gums would start to heal. The mothers looked at him skeptically, but they let the children drink it. 5 days later, the boy's mother came to Daniel. Her face looked strange, like someone who had seen something impossible. She said her son's gums had stopped bleeding for the first time in 4 months. Daniel nodded. He said they needed to keep drinking the decoction every day until summer. In the summer, there would be fresh greens and berries, and things would get easier. The mother stood silently. Then she left. The next morning, a small pie lay on the barn threshold, a small one, made of gray barley flour with a filling of dried turnip, crooked and burnt on one side. Daniel ate it standing in the doorway and gazed at the village for a long time. Smoke from the chimneys, children's shouts, the lowing of a lone cow somewhere behind the houses. He didn't know how to get home. He didn't know if he was alive in that world or dead. He didn't know why he was here. But the pie was warm, and it had been baked for him, because his knowledge had saved a child's teeth. In this world, where people died from a lack of sour berries, that was enough to get up in the morning and keep working. May was long and wet. It rained every other day. Daniel rejoiced at every rain, though the villagers grumbled and cursed the sky. For them, rain in May meant dampness in their homes and mud up to their knees. For Daniel, rain in May meant the seeds would soak up water and the roots would go deep, that the compost pile would get moisture and the decomposition process would speed up, that the southern field, which was now breathing thanks to the ditch, would get water from above and the excess would drain away. Everything was working, slowly, imperceptibly to the outside eye, but it was working. The peas sprouted first. Small green sprouts pushed through the dark soil on Halder's plot, and Daniel crouched down beside them and watched them for a long time. The sprouts were healthy, strong. In the neighboring bed, the barley had also sprouted, but next to the peas, its stalks were noticeably greener than in the control plot where the barley grew alone. In 2 months, the difference would be obvious. In 4, undeniable. But for now, only he could see it. To everyone else, the field was just a field, green and green. Daniel understood that he needed patience. His main enemy was not Bren, nor was it hunger. His main enemy was time. Everything he knew required time, which hungry people did not have. Breeding takes generations. Crop rotation takes years. Compost takes months. And people want to eat today. That is why he did small things in parallel, quick things, visible, things that yielded results not in a year, but in a week. He taught 4 women how to ferment cabbage. There was cabbage, a little. Last year's crop from the cellars. It was starting to wilt. Usually, they just boiled it in soup until it turned into a gray rag, tasteless and useless. Daniel showed them another way. Chop it finely, salt it, knead it with your hands until the juice comes out. Pack it into an oak barrel. Press it down with a stone. Wait 5 days. After 5 days, open it and get sauerkraut. Sour, crunchy, full of vitamin C and lactic acid bacteria, which he called good, invisible creatures living in the sourness. The women did as he showed them, with the expression of people carrying out a meaningless order. On the 5th day, they opened the barrel. The cabbage was ready. Daniel watched as Maeve took the first bite. She chewed slowly. Then she looked at Daniel. There was something new in her eyes. Not surprise, amazement. She said it was delicious, simply and quietly. It's delicious. Daniel smiled. 2 days later, half the village was already pickling. The cabbage became Daniel's first tangible gift, something you could taste on your tongue. People don't believe in words or promises. People believe in taste. If the food is good, it means the person who made it knows what they're doing. It's simple logic that works in any century. Another small project was the vegetable garden. Daniel cleared a plot by the shed, his own, a small one, 4 by 8 feet. He planted turnips in it differently, not like the locals, who just stuck seeds haphazardly into the hard-packed soil, but with preparation. He dug deep, added a handful of immature compost that was already loose enough, made even furrows, sowed them a palm's width apart, watered them. When the turnips sprouted, they twice as fast as in the neighboring gardens. The greens were brighter, the stems were thicker. People walked by and watched, at first surreptitiously, then openly. Old Greta, the village midwife and herbalist, came over once and stood over the garden bed for a long time. She didn't say a word to Daniel, but the next day she dug her garden deeper than usual. Daniel noticed and said nothing. That was more important than any words. When a person copies your actions in silence, they have already believed. They're just not ready to admit it. In mid-May, what Daniel had both hoped for and feared happened. Bren stepped up for the Sunday sermon and spoke of him, without naming names, but in a way that everyone understood. He said that a stranger had appeared in the village who teaches strange things, who talks about invisible creatures in a manure pile and spirits in the air that feed on peas, who heals children not with prayer but with sour brew made from forest berries. He said this was a path to disaster, that God had given people prayer and the earth, and all they needed to do was pray more fervently, and whoever seeks other paths is seeking the way to the devil's. Daniel stood in the crowd and listened. His heart beat steadily. He knew this moment would come. In any culture, in any era, a person with new knowledge faces people whose power rests on ignorance. Bren wasn't evil. He was frightened. His world was built on the idea that God controls the harvest and the priest controls the connection to God. If the harvest depends on compost and peas, then what's the point of a priest? Bren wasn't defending God. Bren was defending himself. Daniel didn't respond. He didn't argue in public. That would have been a mistake. Instead, that evening he went to Bren's house, alone, no witnesses. Bren opened the door and stared at him. Daniel said he'd come to talk, not to argue, to talk. Bren let him in reluctantly. Daniel sat down on a bench. He looked around. The priest's house was just as poor as all the others, maybe a little cleaner. A wooden symbol of the faith hung on the wall. Bren sat down across from him. His face was impassive. He waited. Daniel said he had nothing against the church, nothing against prayer, nothing against God. He said that God created the earth and everything on it. God created peas, too, and manure, too. And the ability of manure to turn into good soil comes from God, too. He doesn't invent anything new. He just looks closely at what God has already created. Bren listened. His face didn't change. Then he asked where Daniel knew all this from. Daniel said from his father, and from his father's father, that in his family everyone had worked the land, generation after generation. It was a lie, but a lie the priest could accept. Bren was silent for a moment. Then he said he would watch, that if by fall it was clear that Daniel's methods were from God and not from demons, he would say nothing. But if even one person suffered, he would write to the city. Daniel stood up. He nodded, said it was fair. He went out. On the street, he exhaled. His hands were shaking. Not from the cold, from tension. He had just walked a tightrope. Bren had given him time, until fall. 4 months. In 4 months, he had to show results that would silence any skeptic. The peas had to grow. The barley next to the peas had to yield more than barley without peas. The compost had to mature. The southern field had to dry out. And all of this had to happen on time. June brought sunshine. Not hot, but enough. The peas were blooming, small white flowers on slender stems. Daniel walked through the fields every morning and checked. He touched the leaves. He looked at the roots. He watched the color of the foliage. On Halder's plot, the barley next to the peas was a hand's breadth taller than on the control plot. A hand's breadth. It wasn't just Daniel who could see it anymore. Halder came himself. He stood on the boundary between the two halves of the field. He looked to one side, then the other. He said nothing. But that evening he sent Daniel a jug of beer, the first one ever. On Torvald's plot, the peas were growing worse. The soil was very poor, but even there the difference was noticeable. The old man came every day and sat on a rock by his field and watched. Sometimes he fell asleep, woke up, watched again. Once he told Daniel that in 70 years it was the first time he'd seen barley so green on his land, and that if it was witchcraft, then so be it. He didn't care anymore. Daniel laughed, the first time in 2 months. By the end of June, he began building another ditch with the grown men, the second one. This one ran parallel to the first and drained water from the western edge of the southern field. The work went faster. People already knew what to do. They didn't ask why. They just dug. Something shifted in the village. Not abruptly, not loudly. Quietly, like water finding a new channel. People were starting to do what Daniel did. Not because he ordered them to, Because they saw that it worked. Greta dug up the vegetable garden. Maeve started pickling not only cabbage, but also turnips. 2 households, of their own accord, planted peas in small patches near their houses. Keelan, Halder's son, came to the barn every evening and asked questions. How compost works. Why peas help barley. Why water needs to drain from the field. He wanted to understand, not just repeat. Daniel answered every question, patiently, in detail. This boy was the first person in Grayford who wanted to know not what to do, but why. July turned out to be dry. The nights were warm. Daniel lay in the barn with the door open and looked at the stars. The stars were unfamiliar, different constellations, a different sky. He never got used to it. Every evening he would lie down and wait for a second, hoping to wake up in his apartment in Ames with a view of the parking lot and the smell of the coffee maker. He didn't wake up. Every morning, the same barn, the same straw, the same smell of the forge. And every morning he would get up and go to work. Because the fields don't wait. By midsummer, the compost pile had matured. Daniel turned it over with a shovel and froze. Inside was a black, crumbly mass that smelled like forest soil after rain. Rich, fertile, full of nutrients. He scooped up a handful and rubbed it between his fingers. The structure was perfect. Moisture levels were normal, no smell of ammonia. The process was complete. He called for Halder. The village elder came over. He looked at the pile of black soil, sniffed it, rubbed it between his fingers. For the first time, something resembling respect appeared on his face. Not trust yet, respect. He said that this soil smelled like the soil by the river, the best soil in the area. Daniel nodded. He said that this pile could fertilize 2 vegetable gardens. By next summer, if they composted all the village manure, there would be enough for an entire field. Halder looked at him. He asked why no one had done this before. Daniel thought for a moment. Then he said it was probably because no one had explained it. Halder grunted. It was a simple answer, and an honest one. The barley in the fields was filling out. The ears were getting heavier. Daniel walked along the field boundaries and counted. He literally counted. He measured out identical plots in the pea barley field and in Halder's pure barley field. Identical area, same soil, same crop. The only difference was the peas. When he counted the ears and estimated the weight of the grain based on the size of the ears, his breath caught in his throat. The pea barley plot yielded about 1 to 5. 5 grains for every 1 sown. Pure barley yielded 3 to 1, as always, just like every year lately. Almost double the difference. On the very same land, in a single season. Daniel sat down on the field boundary and stayed there for a long time. He knew it would be like this. He taught this to his students. He drew graphs on the board. He showed slides. But graphs and slides are one thing. It's another thing entirely to stand in a stranger's field, in a stranger's world, and see the science you taught working right before your eyes. How the pea, a small, unassuming plant, quietly does what it has been doing for millions of years. It takes nitrogen from the air, gives it to the earth. The earth feeds the barley. The barley feeds the people. A simple chain, beautiful, perfect. And in this world, no one had seen it for 200 years. The harvest began in August. Daniel helped. He cut the barley with a sickle along with everyone else. The sickle was dull and awkward. His hands were covered in calluses and cuts. By evening, his back wouldn't straighten. But he kept reaping. The men were watching him. A stranger who can say clever things is one thing. A stranger who toils in the field alongside everyone else is another. When they had threshed the grain and shoveled it into sacks, Halder counted it himself. It took a long time, in silence. Then he turned to Daniel. His face was stony. He said they'd gotten almost twice as much from the pea patch as from the regular one. Daniel nodded. He knew. Halder stood there. Then he did something Daniel hadn't expected. He held out his hand. Daniel shook it. Halder squeezed hard. The handshake of a man who says nothing with words but speaks with his hands. It was a handshake that meant, I trust you. That evening, Halder gathered the heads of the 10 households. The men sat in his house and listened as Daniel outlined the plan for the coming year. 4 fields instead of 2. Crop rotation. Peas on all plots. Compost. Expanding the drainage system on the southern field. And one more thing that Daniel had been putting off until now. Selection. He explained it simply. Right now, they take the grain for sowing from a common pile, without sorting. Whatever they get, that's what they sow. But it needs to be done differently. Every fall, they need to select the best ears of grain, the largest, the healthiest, with the heaviest kernels, and sow only those. In 3 years, the grain will be larger. In 5 years, noticeably larger. In 10, it will be a different variety. The men listened. Some nodded, some frowned. Old man Torvald said it sounded like you were selecting the strongest bulls for breeding. Daniel said, yes, exactly like that, only with grain. Torvald nodded. He understood that. Cattle breeders had been selecting the best animals for thousands of years, but for some reason had never applied the same logic to grain. Daniel didn't explain that this particular discovery had changed everything in his world. He simply suggested they get started. The men agreed. Not all of them. 7 out of 10. 3 said their grandfathers hadn't selected and had lived just fine. Daniel didn't argue. 3 farms out of 10 is normal. Next year, there will be more. When those 7 show results. September came, and Daniel stopped for the first time in 6 months. Not literally. He worked every day. But inside, something had stopped. He stood on the hill above Grayford and looked out at the fields, at the golden swabs of harvest, at the smoke rising from the chimneys, at the people moving between the houses. And he thought about how 6 months ago he had been lying in the mud in that same field, not knowing if he was alive. Lena appeared beside him. She was often by his side now, silent, not getting in the way, just there. She brought a piece of bread with sauerkraut. She held it out to him. Daniel took it. The bread was coarse, the cabbage was sour, but it was bread that had grown in the field he had helped fertilize, and cabbage he had taught them to ferment. He ate and looked at the village. Lena stood beside him and looked too. She said quietly that her father had smiled for the first time yesterday, at dinner, just like that, for no reason. Daniel looked at her. Lena was looking at the village. Her eyes were gray and calm, the same eyes that had looked at him when he was lying in the mud in the field. Only back then, there was fear in them, and now, something else. She turned to him and said that in the past, everyone in the village was silent in the fall, because fall is the beginning of waiting. Waiting for winter, waiting for death. But this year, people are talking and laughing. She said he was the one who made it happen. Daniel shook his head. He said they did it themselves. He just showed them. They dug, they sowed, they harvested. He had only shown them where to dig and what to sow. Lena looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded and smiled for the first time. A small smile, fleeting, like the first sprout that breaks through and immediately hides from the wind. But Daniel saw it. He smiled back. October was starting off cold. Daniel knew that winter in this world was long and harsh. 6 months, from October to the end of April. He needed to prepare the village for something none of them had done before. Systematic stockpiling. He gathered the women. He explained the plan. Sauerkraut, pickled turnips, dried berries, rosehip tea brewed in advance, smoked turnips, bean concentrates, dried peas ground into flour for soup. He demonstrated each method of preservation personally. Maeve helped with the drying and smoking. She knew how the oven worked better than any man in the village. Her hands were steady and precise. She sliced the turnips into thin strips and laid them out on a rack over the coals, and after 2 days, they turned into dry, light strips that could be stored for months. Daniel showed her how to grind dried peas into flour using stones, and how to cook a thick stew from that flour. Maeve tried it. She said it tasted better than regular porridge. Daniel said it was healthier too. Protein. She didn't know what protein was. He said it was what made people strong. She nodded. She understood that. Halder set aside a corner in the community house for storage. Daniel insisted on proper ventilation. They cut 2 holes in the walls, one at the bottom, one at the top. Air flowed from bottom to top and dried the supplies. Simple physics. But for Grayford, it was a revelation. Usually, supplies were stored in cellars where it was damp and dark, and half of them had rotted by February. The village was preparing for winter, and for the first time in many years, there was a system to these preparations. Not just gathering as much as possible and hoping it would be enough, but calculating how many mouths to feed, how many days, how much was needed per person per day. Daniel did the math. Lena took notes. He had taught her numbers and letters over the summer, in the evenings in the barn by the light of a torch, with a coal on flat stones. She picked it up instantly. She could calculate in her head faster than some of his students in Iowa. She kept track of the supplies: barrels of sauerkraut, sacks of dried turnips, pots of rosehip tea, bundles of smoked meat, sacks of grain. Everything counted, everything recorded. Daniel made a 6-month calculation. With current supplies and the current number of people, the village could make it through the winter. Barely, but it could. If there were no widespread diseases, if there were no fires, if. A lot of ifs. But for the first time, there was a calculation. For the first time, winter wasn't a darkness into which you fall without knowing the bottom, but a problem with conditions and a solution. The first snow fell in early October. Daniel stood in the doorway of the barn and watched as white flakes covered the ground. His ground. That's exactly how he thought of it. His ground. Not because it belonged to him, because he had put his hands and his knowledge and his time into it. And now it lay dormant under the snow, its soil holding the roots of the clover he had sown on the wasteland. And within it lay the remnants of pea roots, full of nitrogen-fixing nodules. And the earth was gathering strength for spring, which would surely come. Winter was long and dark and quiet, but not like before. Before, the silence in Grayford in winter was the silence of waiting for death. Now it was the silence of waiting, just waiting, without fear. Well, almost without fear. December came like a blow. The temperature dropped overnight, and by morning the water in the buckets was covered with a crust of ice as thick as a finger. The wind blew from the north without ceasing. The walls of the shed by the smithy didn't hold the heat, and Daniel woke up with frost on his blanket. Ansgar silently carried him into the house, without asking, without explaining. Just that evening, Lena came and said, "Pack your things." The blacksmith's house was small, 2 rooms. In one, a forge and an anvil. In the other, they lived. A bench against the wall, a stove, a table. They made a bed for Daniel on the floor by the stove. The heat radiated from the stones, and for the first time in a week, he slept without waking up from the cold. In the morning, Ansgar sat at the table and ate porridge in silence. Lena served it. They set a bowl in front of Daniel. He sat down. He ate. He was silent. Ansgar was silent. Lena was silent. The silence was not hostile, just familiar. These two had lived in silence ever since Lena's mother and younger brother had died. 5 years of silence. Daniel did not break it. He simply lived within it. The first 2 weeks of December passed quietly. The village followed its winter routine. The men repaired their tools, the women spun and wove, the children stayed indoors. Every day, Daniel checked the storeroom. He opened the barrels of sauerkraut. He sniffed. He tasted. The cabbage was good, sour, lively. The sacks of grain stood against the warm wall, dry and intact. The dried turnips hadn't gone moldy. The peas in the sacks were firm and clean. He kept track. Every day, he crossed off a line on the board he'd hung in the storeroom. Lena did the same in her records. They had a system. 6 months, 180 days, that many mouths to feed, that much food, that much per person per day. The math didn't lie. It should be enough. By mid-December, the cold set in, making the logs crack. Daniel had never experienced such cold. Winters in Iowa could be harsh, but there was central heating and warm clothes and hot food from the store across the street. Here, there was none of that. Just the stove, just a woolen blanket, just porridge, and the cold that crept under his skin and lived there like a parasite. At the end of December, old Greta fell ill, the midwife. Her cough turned into wheezing, a fever. Daniel went to see her. She was lying on a bench under a pile of rags, hot, pale. Her breathing was wheezing. He knew what it was, pneumonia, or bronchitis on the verge of pneumonia. In his world, antibiotics would clear it up in 3 days. Here, there were no antibiotics. He did what he could. Hot drinks, lots of them. Rosehip tea. Warm stones wrapped in cloth placed on her feet and chest. Ventilation. He insisted on a crack in the door for fresh air, even though the family screamed that the cold would kill her faster than the cough. Daniel explained that stale air in a closed house was worse than the cold, that illness thrives in stagnant breath. They didn't believe him. He insisted. Greta coughed for a week. Her fever rose at night and fell by morning. Daniel came every morning and every evening. He gave her herbal tea. He checked her breathing. He changed the stones. On the 8th day, the fever subsided. Greta opened her eyes and looked at him, cloudy, aged eyes. She said in a hoarse whisper that he was as stubborn as a goat. Daniel replied that goats are resilient. She closed her eyes. On her lips was something resembled a smile. After that, Greta became his silent ally, not loudly, not publicly, but when one of the women started muttering that the stranger was talking nonsense, Greta would interject with a single sentence. She would say that the stranger had pulled her out of the grave with fresh air and berry water, and the women would fall silent. That Greta was feared and respected in the village more than the priest. January was the hardest month, a bitter month. That's what they called it in Greyford, the month when they start eating bark. Only this year, no one ate bark. Supplies held out. Sauerkraut and turnips were handed out every day, 1 portion per person. Pea soup was cooked in the community house every morning. Maeve baked bread every other day. Not every day. They were conserving the grain. But there was bread, and there was soup, and there was sauerkraut. Daniel kept a hawk's eye on the consumption. Every evening he counted, recounted, cross-checked with Lena's records. The supply was dwindling, but according to schedule, not any faster. People ate little, but they ate every day. No one starved to the point of fainting. No one went to bed from weakness. It was unbelievable. In past winters, people had already started dying by January. First the old people, then the children, then the frail women. This year, no one died in January. No one in February either. Daniel didn't sleep at night. He did the math in the dark. He estimated. There were 2 months' worth of supplies left, March and April, the hardest months, because winter had already worn the bodies down and spring hadn't come yet. He implemented a rationing plan. He cut portions by 10%. He explained to Halder that it was better to eat a little less every day than to eat their fill now and starve in April. Halder agreed. The village accepted it, without complaint. Because the people saw Lena's chart, the numbers on the board, sticks and lines. They couldn't read, but they could count sticks, and they saw that there were still more sticks for supplies than sticks for days. It was a new feeling, not hope, more precise than hope. Knowledge. We know how much we have. We know how much we need. We know it will be enough. In March, Daniel did what he had promised himself from day one. He began to teach. Not just Lena and not just Keelan. He gathered everyone who wanted to listen in the community hall that evening. 12 people came. Keelan, Lena, 3 young men from the group that had been digging the ditch, 2 women from the group that had been pickling cabbage, old Torvald, Maeve, 3 others whose names Daniel didn't know. He stood before them and began to speak. He explained why peas help barley. He explained that there are forces in the soil that nourish plants and that these forces can be replenished. He explained that compost is a way to give back to the soil what the plants have taken from it. He explained that if you select the best seeds every year, in 5 years the grain will be larger, and in 10 years it will be a completely different variety. He spoke simply, without scientific terms. He clothed every thought in images they could understand. Nitrogen became an air force. Bacteria became the earth's invisible workers. Crop rotation became rest for the field, just as rest is for the plowman. People listened. Some nodded, others frowned. Torvald dozed off 5 minutes in, but woke up and said he'd heard everything. Keelan asked a question. He asked if that same air power could be captured by other plants, not just peas. Daniel looked at him and thought that in 10 years, this kid would know more than half of his students. He said yes. Lever catches it too, and lentils, and beans. All plants that have small growths on their roots. Because those very invisible workers live in those growths, the ones that take energy from the air and give it to the earth. Keelan nodded slowly. His eyes were burning. It was hunger. Not hunger of the stomach, hunger of the mind. Daniel recognized that look. He'd seen it in his best students, in those who would become scientists, in those who would change the world. Late March, the last days of winter. Snow still lay on the ground, but it was already gray and loose. Drops fell from the roofs. The air smelled different, of moisture and earth. Daniel opened the last chest of winter supplies and counted them. There was enough for another month. They had made it through. He gathered the village in the community hall. Everyone came, all 78 households, men, women, old people, children. The house was packed to the brim. Daniel stood by the far wall next to Halder. Halder stood up. He looked at the people. He wasn't eloquent. He didn't know how to give speeches. He simply stated the truth. He said that no one had died over the winter. Not an old man, no child. For the first time in his memory. For the first time in his father's memory. For the first time in as many years as Grayford had stood on this spot. Silence. Then Torvald stood up, slowly, on unsteady legs, and bowed to Daniel at the waist. Behind him stood Maeve. Behind her, Greta. Behind her, the mother of the boy Daniel had cured of scurvy. One after another, yard after yard. The whole village stood and bowed in silence. Daniel stood there, not knowing what to say. His throat tightened. His eyes stung. He stood among people who 6 months ago had wanted to drive him out and who were now bowing to him because their children were alive. He didn't say a word, because there were no words, in any language, neither in English nor in the one he spoke in this world. He just stood there and cried, for the first time since he'd been here. Lena stood beside him. She was silent too, but her hand found his and squeezed it, briefly, firmly, and let go. April of the second year began with rain, warm, heavy. The very rain that wakes the earth and makes it smell so that Daniel's breath caught in his throat every time. He stood at the edge of the southern field and watched the water drain away through the ditches. Both were working, the first and the second. The field was drying out quickly. The black, peaty soil steamed in the sun. He crouched down, scooped up a handful, squeezed it. The texture was already changing. After a year of drainage, the soil had become looser, less dense. The air penetrated deeper. The roots would grow better. This field was ready. For the first time in decades, it was possible to sow it in earnest. Daniel unfolded the plan he had been sketching all winter on flat pieces of birch bark. 4 fields. The first for barley and peas. The second for peas and turnips. The third for grain barley. The fourth rests under clover. The fields rotate every year. Rotation. The soil never gets depleted because the peas return nitrogen to it and the clover gives it a rest. He showed the plan to Halder. The village head looked at it for a long time. He ran his finger along the lines. Then he said he understood, and that 7 households were already waiting for instructions. Daniel corrected him. Not instructions, explanations. He wasn't a commander, he was an advisor. Halder looked at him. He said that in the village it was one and the same. Daniel smiled. They began sowing in mid-April. Now it wasn't the work of 3 households' volunteers. Now almost the entire village was working. 35 men and women in the fields. Lena walked around with birch bark notes and told everyone what to sow. Keelan marked out the fields with sticks and ropes. Daniel darted between the plots. He checked the depth of the furrows. He checked the distance between the seeds. He showed them how to plant the peas in the ground correctly, not too deep, 2 fingers width, so the roots could reach the light faster. He slipped up again. The locals asked what light had to do with it if the roots were underground. Daniel realized he'd said the wrong thing. The stems would reach the light. The roots would stay in the ground and draw in the life-giving energy from the air. The men nodded. They were used to his strange slips of the tongue. Daniel spread compost on the southern field, the entire first ridge. They carried the black, crumbly mass in buckets and scattered it across the surface. Then they plowed it in. The field absorbed the compost like a sponge absorbs water. Daniel sowed it with barley and peas, the best seeds from those selected in the fall, the first generation of targeted selection. The grains were slightly larger than usual, slightly heavier. The difference was minimal, but it was there. After 3 generations of selection, the difference would become noticeable. After 5, significant. After 10, it would be a different variety. Patience, the key word in his work. Patience. In early May, strangers arrived in Grayford. 6 of them. Ragged, thin, 3 men, 2 women. The youngest was carrying a child. Refugees from the north. Their village had been wiped out over the winter, entirely. 100 households. No one left. They'd been walking south for 3 weeks, eating bark and moss. The child was barely breathing. Halder went out to meet them. He looked. He turned to Daniel. Daniel said, "Take them in." Halder frowned. He said that extra mouths to feed were a risk. Daniel said that 6 pairs of hands weren't mouths, but workers. That the southern field was large. That if these 6 worked in the field, by fall they would have earned back every piece of bread they ate over the summer. Halder thought. Then he nodded. The refugees were fed. Pea soup, sauerkraut, bread. The youngest woman ate and cried. Not out of grief, because there was food. It was simply there. Daniel looked at her and recognized her. Red-haired, freckled, a child in her arms. 2 little sisters huddled against her on either side. No, not 2. The child in her arms and a girl of about 12 beside her. It was Aiden. He didn't know her name yet. He found out that evening when he came to check on how the refugees had been settled. They had been housed in one of the abandoned houses. The roof had been patched up that day. The stove was working. Aiden sat by the fire, feeding her younger sister porridge from a spoon. Her movements were mechanical. Her face was blank. Her eyes were dry. Daniel had seen eyes like that in refugee camps in Africa. When a person had gone through so much that everything inside had burned out, leaving only a shell that moves and eats and breathes, but is no longer alive. He didn't speak to her. Not now. It was too soon. Instead, he spoke with the eldest of the male refugees. The man said that Aiden had led them, from the very beginning. When the village began to die, she gathered those who could walk and led them south. Along the way, they buried Aiden's mother and her older brother. Her mother had died of starvation. Her brother from a wound that had become infected. Aiden dug the graves herself and kept going. Daniel nodded. He went outside. He stood in the street and breathed in the cold night air. He thought about how, in any world and in any era, there are people who take responsibility for others, not because they are strong, but because someone has to. 3 days later, Aiden came to him, on her own, without preamble. She said she'd heard he healed people with food. She said she'd been an herbalist's assistant in her village, that she knew the local plants, which ones were medicinal, which ones are poisonous, which ones are edible, though few people know that. Daniel listened. Then he asked if she could make a list of all the plants she knew, with a description of what each one does. Aiden hesitated. She said she didn't know how to write. Daniel said he would dictate it and Lena would write it down. Or he could teach Aiden to write, just like he taught Lena. Aiden looked at him. For the first time ever, something flashed in her eyes. Not joy, interest. A tiny spark in her dull eyes. She said, "Okay, teach me." That's how Grayford's herbalist began. Every evening after work, Daniel, Aiden, and Lena sat in Ansgar's house. Aiden named a plant. She described what it looked like, where it grew, what it treated. Daniel compared it to what he knew. He looked for overlaps between the folk medicine of this world and what he remembered from his botany course. Often they matched. A local herb that Arin called silverweed, and which was used for stomach upset, according to the description, resembled yarrow. Another herb that was called bitter tear and used to treat fever resembled wormwood. The similarities were no coincidence. Plants from different worlds solved the same problems in the same ways. Evolution had followed similar paths. Daniel couldn't explain this to the locals. He simply wrote it down. Lena wrote. Arin dictated. The three of them were creating Greyford's first pharmacopoeia. Arin was changing, slowly. Every evening, as she worked, she came alive just a little. She began to talk about more than just herbs. She told him about her village, about her mother, about her brother. She spoke quickly and incoherently. Sometimes she would burst into laughter that immediately turned to tears. Daniel didn't interrupt. He didn't comfort her. He just listened, and gave her a task for the next day. 10 more herbs, 5 more descriptions. The work kept her afloat, kept her from drowning. June. Peas were blooming in all the fields, white spots on green, beautiful. Daniel stood on the hill and looked down on Greyford. The village had changed over the year. Not on the outside. Outwardly, it was still the same log houses and thatched roofs. But neat garden beds had appeared in the vegetable patches. Every yard had a compost pile. The southern field was a smooth green carpet. The ditch had been widened and reinforced with stones. People were moving down the street, and there was something different about their gait. Daniel didn't realize what it was at first. Then he realized. They weren't shuffling. Before, everyone walked like old people, slowly, hunching over. Now they walked straighter, faster. The food was doing its job. Protein from peas, vitamins from pickled vegetables and rose hips, calories from normal bread. Their bodies were coming to life, like a field after compost. Lena walked over and stood beside him. She was doing this more and more often, just standing beside him, silently. Daniel had gotten used to it. He liked it. Her silence wasn't empty. It was like a warm wall behind his back. You know she's there, and that makes you calmer. She said more people were coming from the north. 2. A man and a woman. They'd seen them on the road. Daniel nodded. Greyford was starting to draw people in. Rumors were spreading. A village where no one had died over the winter. A village where there was food. In a world where hunger is the norm, such rumors travel faster than the wind. He knew this was both good and dangerous. Good because more hands meant more fields. Dangerous because the rumors would reach not only the refugees. They would reach those who had power and weapons. And then a different story would begin. The rumors spread faster than Daniel had expected. In mid-June, a rider appeared on the road to Greyford. One, on a fine horse, wearing a sturdy cloak with a coat of arms on the clasp. He rode through the village without stopping. He looked around. He looked at the fields, at the vegetable gardens, at the compost piles by the yards, at the children running down the street who didn't look like skin-covered skeletons. Then he turned around and rode away. Halder stood by his house and watched him go. The village elder's face was gray. He approached Daniel and said that this was Baron Verkast's man, a scout. Now the Baron knows. Daniel asked what kind of man the Baron was. Halder said that Verkast wasn't the worst, not the cruelest, but not kind either. A pragmatist. His lands border Greyford. He hadn't paid any attention to the village before because there's nothing to take from beggars. Now he will. Because a village that isn't starving is a village you can take from. Daniel nodded. This was what he'd been waiting for. Power always follows success. That's the law of any world. He began to prepare, not for war, for negotiations. For the next 3 weeks, he questioned Halder about the barony of Verkast. How many villages? What taxes? What relations with the crown? What were its relations with the church? Halder spoke reluctantly. He wasn't used to thinking about politics. He was used to thinking about how to survive the winter. But Daniel drew the information out of him, drop by drop. Baron Verkast owned 12 villages, all poor, all starving. The tide was heavy but not unbearable, a third of the harvest. In a good year, that meant the peasants had enough left over. In a bad year, it meant death. The Baron lived in a castle 2 days' journey away. He had a retinue of 30 swordsmen. a small force by the standards of the great lords, but enough to crush any village. Greyford did not formally belong to Vercast. The village stood on no man's land, near the border of the barony. This used to be an advantage. No one collected taxes. But no one provided protection either. Now it had become a vulnerability. A village without a lord is a village without protection. Anyone who came with swords could take whatever they wanted. In early July, the Baron sent 3 men, no longer a scout, an administrator with 2 guards. The administrator was a gaunt man with a piercing gaze and a notebook. He walked around the village for half a day. He counted the courtyards. He counted the fields. He looked into the barn. He looked into the storeroom. He took notes. The guards stood nearby in silence, hands on their swords, not threatening, just showing that they were there. In the evening, the steward sat down with Halder in the community hall. Daniel sat nearby. The steward said that Baron Vercast had taken notice of Greyford's successes, that the Baron was pleased to see a thriving village on his borders, and that the Baron was offering protection and patronage in exchange for half the harvest. Half. Daniel felt Halder freeze beside him. Half the harvest was a death sentence. With half, they wouldn't make it through the winter. Everything he'd built over the past year and a half would collapse in a single season. Daniel spoke up. The steward looked at him in surprise. A stranger, a man of no lineage, speaking in the presence of the Baron's representative. But Daniel spoke calmly and confidently. He knew this game. Not from the Middle Ages, from Africa, from Southeast Asia, from every place where he'd worked and where a local chieftain or official came to take what others had grown. He told the steward that the Baron was a wise man, that a wise man understands the difference between a chicken and an egg. You can take the chicken and eat it once, or you can take the eggs every day. Greyford is a chicken that has just started laying eggs. If you take half, the village will weaken. The fields will return to their former state. In 2 years, the Baron will receive half of nothing. But if you take a tenth, the village will continue to grow. In 2 years, the harvest will double. A tenth of a double harvest is more than half of the current one. The steward listened. His eyes were cold and calculating. He took notes. He said he would pass it on to the Baron. And he left. Halder sat in silence. Then he asked Daniel why he had promised the Baron a double harvest in 2 years. Daniel said he hadn't promised anything. He had made a forecast, and the forecast was realistic. If crop rotation continued, breeding produced improved seeds, and the southern field operated at full capacity, a double harvest in 2 years was entirely achievable. Halder looked at him. He asked, "And if not?" Daniel paused. Then he said that in that case, they would have problems. But there would be problems either way. Better problems with a tithe than with half the harvest. The Baron's reply arrived 10 days later. A messenger brought the letter. Halder couldn't read. Daniel read it. The Baron agreed to the tithe, but on one condition. In 2 years, if the harvest didn't double, the tax would rise to a third. And one more thing. The Baron wanted to know who this stranger was who was teaching the peasants. He wanted to see him in person, next spring. Daniel folded the letter. He thought, a year. He had a year to double the harvest and prepare for the meeting with the Baron. It was possible. Difficult, but possible. In July and August, he worked harder than ever. Compost piles, the second generation of selected grain, expanding of the southern field, a third drainage ditch for the new plot, education, classes every evening in the community hall. Now 20 people were coming. Aideen taught about herbs, Lena kept records. Keelan began teaching the other guys what he'd learned from Daniel. A chain. Knowledge was passed on, not through one person, but through a network. This was exactly what Daniel wanted. He couldn't be everywhere. He couldn't explain it to everyone personally. But if 10 people understood, and each explained it to 2 more, then 20 knew, and then 40, and then the whole village. At the end of August, the harvest came in. Daniel counted. Lena counted. Keelan counted. They counted 3 times. The numbers were as follows. The northern field, barley and peas, 6-1, 6 grains for every one sown. Compared to last year's 5-1. Growth, slow, but growth. The southern field with compost, 7-1. Daniel read the number and read it again, 7-1. On land that had been a swamp a year ago. The compost, drainage, and peas had done their job. It was more than twice Grayford's average yield from 2 years ago. The western field was the control plot without peas, 6-1, as always, just like every year lately. The difference was no longer a matter of a hand's width or a glance. The difference was in the sacks, in real sacks of grain that you could touch and pour and count. Halder counted the sacks, and his hands were shaking. Not from old age, from something else. He didn't cry. Village elders don't cry. But he stood by the sacks of grain, and his lips trembled. Daniel had given the tithe. Honestly, he'd counted out 1/10. They loaded it onto a cart, sent it to the baron. The rest was hidden in the barn and the storehouse. There was more than enough. Enough for the whole winter. Enough for everyone, including the newcomers. There was enough. The autumn festival in Grayford this year wasn't like it usually was. Usually, the autumn festival was quiet. People thanked God for having survived and prayed quietly to survive again. This year, they celebrated. For real. Maeve baked bread from the new flour, whiter than usual, lighter, tastier, from grain from the southern field. She baked all day, and by evening, loaves that smelled like real bread stood on the table in the community hall. Not that gray, heavy brick everyone had grown accustomed to, but bread, with a crust, with a crumb. People ate and couldn't believe it was made from their own grain, from their own fields. Beer was brewed from barley from the southern fields, cloudy, strong, bitter, but their own. Daniel drank and smiled. The taste was a far cry from any beer he'd tried in Iowa, but this was beer made from barley he'd helped grow, and that made the taste different. People sang, danced. Children ran between the tables. Erin sat in the corner with her sisters and smiled. She wasn't laughing. She couldn't yet, but she was smiling. That was a lot. For her, it was a lot. October of the second year. The trees on the hills beyond Grayford stood red and gold. Daniel sat on the porch of Ansgar's house and sharpened a knife, a habit. He needed the knife for work, to cut samples, to trim roots, to mark trees. His hands worked on their own while his mind thought. He thought of Thomas, of the man who had been burned 300 years ago for doing the very same thing Daniel was doing, for knowledge. He didn't know Thomas's name yet. He didn't know that his notes lay in a sealed book in the Order's archives, but he already suspected he wasn't the first. The suspicion arose after a conversation with Greta. One evening, the old midwife told him something strange. She said her grandmother had told her about a man who came to their region a long, long time ago. A stranger. He spoke strangely. He knew things that no one else knew. He taught the peasants how to make the land better. Men in gray robes took him away, and he was never seen again. Daniel asked when this had happened. Greta said her grandmother had told her it was during her great-grandmother's time. Maybe 200 years ago, maybe 300. No one remembers exactly. Daniel didn't press her for more details, but he remembered. Men in gray robes. The Gray Ear. He didn't yet know what kind of organization it was, but the name stuck with him. November brought the cold, and with it came the caravan. 10 wagons, 20 guards, mules, horses, bales of goods. The caravan set up camp by the road outside Grayford. Halder went out to meet them. Daniel went with him. The caravan leader turned out to be a merchant from the east, short, sturdy, with stiff black hair and narrow, watchful eyes. His name was Han Dae-hyun. He was transporting fabrics and spices from the eastern trading cities westward to the seaports. The route lay through this region, and winter caught him earlier than he had expected. The snow fell early. The mountain passes were closed. The caravan was stuck. Han Dae-hyun asked permission to spend the winter near the village. In exchange, he offered payment in silver and goods. Halder looked at Daniel. Daniel nodded. 20 extra mouths to feed for the winter was a serious matter. But silver and goods were things Greyford didn't have. Salt, cloth, tools, spices that could be used for preservation, and more. Trade connections, contact with the outside world. Until now, Greyford had been isolated, an island, on its own. The caravan could serve as a bridge. Halder accepted the caravan. Han Dae-hyun set up camp on the outskirts, neat and organized. His men were disciplined. They didn't make a racket. They didn't wander into the village uninvited. They paid for everything. The merchant knew how to conduct himself on foreign territory. Daniel came to see him on the third day. Han Dae-hyun was sitting at a table in his tent, writing, with a brush, on thin paper, Hanzi characters. Daniel recognized them. They looked like Korean, or Chinese, or something in between. This world was bigger than he'd thought. Eastern merchant guilds meant Eastern civilizations. They meant other languages and cultures and technologies. Han Dae-hyun looked at him, appraisingly. He asked who he was. Daniel said he was the village's agricultural advisor. Han Dae-hyun smirked. He said that in 20 years of traveling trade routes, he had seen hundreds of villages, and not a single one had an agricultural advisor. Daniel said that was why they were all starving. Han Dae-hyun stopped smiling. He looked at Daniel with a different gaze, sharp, interested. He asked what exactly he did. Daniel explained, briefly, about crop rotation, about compost, about drainage, about plant breeding. Han Dae-hyun listened in silence. Then he said that in the East, farmers also rotate crops, but not like that, simpler. And that in the East, compost is made from fish waste. And that in his hometown, rice is grown on flooded terraces that operate on the same principle Daniel was describing. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. A different system of knowledge, a different tradition, a parallel one. Eastern agriculture had developed in its own way. Rice terraces, fish compost, crop rotation. If you combined both sets of knowledge, you could create a system more powerful than either one alone. He asked if Han Dae-hyun could tell him more about Eastern methods. The merchant paused. Then he said that he was a merchant, not a farmer. But his daughter knew more. She read a lot. Too much, in his opinion. His daughter appeared an hour later. Small, quiet, with 2 long black braids and a habit of bowing whenever spoken to. Yerin Han, 17 years old. She sat across from Daniel and looked at him warily. Her father had told her to speak with the foreign advisor. She was used to obeying her father. Daniel asked her about the rice terraces. Yerin began to speak, quietly, cautiously, choosing her words carefully. But the more she spoke, the more freely her speech flowed. She knew a great deal, not just about rice, about sericulture, about tea cultivation, about the canal systems in the eastern cities, about how coastal farmers use seaweed for fertilizer. Daniel listened and asked questions. Yerin answered. Her eyes gradually came alive. She was used to her knowledge not being of interest to anyone. A girl from a merchant family was supposed to know arithmetic, housekeeping, and manners, not agronomy, not history, not botany. But she read everything she could get her hands on. Scrolls at the markets, books in the libraries of the cities the caravan passed through. She memorized them. She stored it in her head like in a chest. And now, for the first time, someone had opened that chest and said there were treasures inside. Daniel suggested she write down everything she knew about Eastern agriculture, to systematize it, to organize it by topic. Yerin looked at him with an expression he didn't immediately read. Then he understood. It was gratitude. Not for the praise, for the fact that he treated her knowledge as something valuable, for the fact that he didn't pat her on the head and say, "Good girl, now go embroider." She nodded. She said she would do it. That same evening, Daniel sat with Han Dae-hyun and drank a hot herbal tea that the merchant had brought with him. Bitter, tart, similar to tea. Han Dae-hyun talked about trade, about grain prices, about how grain in the south costs 3 times as much as here because the southern cities have grown and can't feed themselves. Daniel listened. A plan was forming in his head. Not for this year, for next year. If Grefford starts producing a surplus of grain, that surplus needs a market, a trade connection. Han Dae-hyun's caravan travels this route every year. If they can agree on regular shipments, the village will get silver. And silver means tools, seeds, iron for plows, books. He told Han Dae-hyun that in a year's time, Grefford would have grain to sell. Han Dae-hyun looked at him with interest. He asked how much. Daniel named a figure, a cautious one, a realistic one. Han Dae-hyun thought it over. Then he said that if the figure held up, he would include Grefford in the route. They shook hands. Grefford's first trade agreement. Daniel stepped out of the tent into the frosty night. The stars burned cold and bright, foreign stars of a foreign world. But beneath them stood the village he had begun to build, and nearby were people who believed in him. And ahead lay another winter, but this time he wasn't afraid. The winter of the second year was milder than the first, or so it seemed, because now Daniel was ready. There were plenty of supplies to spare: pickled vegetables, dried berries, pea flour, smoked turnips, grain. Everything was calculated. Everything was recorded in Lena's notebook, which was now no longer flat stones, but sewn sheets of birch bark with neat lines. Han Dae-hyun's caravan stood on the outskirts and went about its business, but gradually the boundaries between the camp and the village were blurring. The caravan guards would come into the village. Villagers would come into the camp. The children played together. The language barrier was fading faster than Daniel had expected. There was only one common language in this world, but Han Dae-hyun's Eastern accent gave the words a different rhythm. After a month, no one noticed the difference. Yeren worked, every day. She sat in her father's tent and wrote, with a brush on paper. She systematized her knowledge of Eastern agriculture, rice terraces, canal systems, seaweed fertilizer, the alternation of fish ponds and rice fields, husk compost, methods of storing grain in clay vessels. Every evening she brought the notes to Daniel. He couldn't read them, hieroglyphs. She translated them orally. He listened and compared them with what he knew. He found parallels. He found differences. He found things he didn't know that changed his own system. The Eastern method of flooded terraces was inapplicable in Grefford. No rice, no conditions. But the principle of controlled flooding could be adapted. The spring flood in the southern field could be not just drained, but directed. Flood the field for a week in early spring. The silt will settle. It will fertilize the soil. Then drain the water through the ditches. You'd get natural fertilizer for free, just like the Nile floods in Egypt. Daniel explained this to Yeren. Her eyes lit up. She understood immediately, the first time. There was no need to explain it twice. There was no need to simplify it. She grasped the essence instantly and asked questions that took things further. She asked if it was possible to control which silt settled, if it was possible to filter the water to keep the beneficial and remove the harmful. Daniel looked at her and said that was an excellent question, and that the answer was yes, it was possible. Through a system of sedimentation tanks. Yeren nodded and began to draw a diagram. Without his help, all by herself. The diagram wasn't perfect, but the principle was correct. Daniel tweaked a few details. Yeren redrew it. Better, more precise. She was learning so quickly that Daniel sometimes felt uneasy. In his world, she would have been a brilliant engineer or a scientist. Here, she was a merchant's daughter being prepared for marriage to the son of a guild elder. The elder lived in the eastern city of Munhyang. According to Yeren, his son was a man in his 30s with heavy hands and a habit of beating servants. Yeren never once said she was afraid of him, but when she spoke about him, her hands would freeze over the paper and the brush would stop moving. Daniel saw it. He said nothing. For now. January. The caravan lived peacefully. Daniel used the winter for what he didn't have time for in the summer: planning. He sat in the evenings with Lena, Kylan, and Yeren and drew maps. Maps of the fields. Maps of the drainage systems. Crop rotation plans for the next 5 years. Breeding calculations. How many generations it would take to increase the grain size by a quarter. How many to double it. Which traits to select for. Size, weight, cold hardiness. Kylan listened and memorized. He couldn't take notes as quickly as Lena, but he understood more deeply. He asked questions that made Daniel pause and think. Once, Keelan asked what would happen if you crossed peas with large pods with peas that had small but abundant pods. Daniel froze. It was a question about hybridization. A 17-year-old boy with no education, in a world without science, asked a question that Gregor Mendel had first formulated in the 19th century. Daniel answered, in detail. He explained dominant and recessive traits. Not in those exact words, of course. He said that every plant has dominant traits and hidden traits. The dominant ones are visible in the first generation. The hidden ones may appear in the second or third. If you cross two plants with different dominant traits, the offspring might produce a plant that combines the best of both. But it takes patience. And records. Lots of records. Keelan nodded. His eyes were shining. He said he wanted to try. Daniel said they would start in the spring. February. One evening, there was a knock at Ansgar's door. Daniel opened it. Standing on the threshold was Shi-hyun, the caravan guard, tall, slender, with short black hair and a scar across her eyebrow. She said the master had sent her for Daniel. Hang Dae-hyun wants to talk. Daniel followed her. It was dark and frosty outside. Shi-hyun walked quickly, without looking back, without slowing down. The gait of a warrior. Her feet landed softly. Her hands were free, ready for anything at any moment. Inside the tent, Han Dae-hyun sat with a serious expression. He poured Daniel some hot tea. Then he said he'd received a letter. Pigeon mail. Caravan merchants kept pigeons for communication. The letter was from the capital. Han Dae-hyun said that in the capital, they knew about Greyford. It wasn't the Baron who told them. The rumors had reached them on their own. A village where no one had died over the winter. A village where the harvest was twice as large as its neighbors. A village where a stranger was teaching the peasants strange things. Han Dae-hyun said that the Order of the Grey Colossus had taken an interest in these rumors. Daniel asked what it was. Han Dae-hyun explained. A church organization, officially responsible for proper farming and prayers for the harvest. In reality, it controls what the peasants sow and how. It has the right to declare any method heresy if it is not approved by the order. It has its own inquisitors, a powerful structure. With the crown, with the great lords, with the merchant guilds. Daniel listened. Something inside him grew cold. Not fear, understanding. He understood why this world was starving. Not only because of the long shadow, not only because of poor soil and lean years. The world is starving because someone wants it to starve. Hunger is not a force of nature. Hunger is a tool. An organization that controls knowledge of agriculture and has the right to declare any innovation heresy is an organization that controls life itself. If peasants can feed themselves, why would they pay the church for prayers for a harvest? If villages aren't starving, why would they need lords who promise protection in exchange for tribute? Hunger is a business. Famine is the foundation of power. And Daniel had just driven a stake through that foundation. Han Dae-hyun looked at him in silence. Then he said that the order had sent a man to investigate, an inquisitor. His name is Father Malak. He will arrive by summer. Daniel drank his tea. His hands were still. His mind was working. Summer. He had 4 months. 4 months to prepare for the man who would come to destroy everything he had built. He finished his tea, set down the cup, thanked Han Dae-hyun for the warning, stood up, left. Shi-hyun was standing on the street. She was waiting to walk him back. Daniel walked on. Shi-hyun walked beside him. She was silent. Then, without turning around, she said that if people with swords came, she could help. Daniel said he hoped swords wouldn't be necessary. Shi-hyun snorted. She said swords were always necessary. It was just that some people were too stubborn to realize it. Daniel smiled. He said that some people are too stubborn to give up. Shi-hyun fell silent. Then she said quietly that it wasn't the worst quality. They reached Ansgar's house. Daniel went inside. He lay down in his spot by the stove. Lena was sleeping on the bench. Ansgar was snoring in the corner. Warm. Quiet. Behind the wall, Greyford slept. Over 80 households now, counting the new ones. alive, well-fed, for the first time in decades. And somewhere on the road toward them was a man whose mission was to put an end to it. Daniel closed his eyes. He wasn't afraid. He would have been if he were alone, but he wasn't alone. He had a village, and the village had a harvest, and numbers, and records, and 20 people who could explain why peas help barley. An inquisitor can burn a single person. He cannot burn the knowledge that is already in 20 minds. Daniel fell asleep. He slept peacefully. Spring of the second year came early. March wasn't over yet, and the snow had already melted from the southern slopes. The earth was breathing. Daniel felt it every morning when he left the house and stood at the edge of the field. Steam rose from the furrows. The air smelled of dampness and life. 4 months. That was all he had before the Inquisitor arrived. 4 months to make Greyford invulnerable. Not with walls, not with swords, with evidence. He started with documentation. Every day he sat down with Lena and Kalen and Yaren and dictated. Records for every field. What was sown? When? How much? What harvest was obtained? Comparisons with control plots. Numbers. Facts. No mysticism, no sorcery. Just observations of nature. If an inquisitor came and asked what Daniel was doing, the answer would be simple. He looks at the ground. He records what he sees. He draws conclusions. He experiments. He records the result. This is not heresy. This is attention. Lena wrote on birch bark in neat, small handwriting she had learned over the course of a year. Keelan kept separate records on selection. Every ear of grain they had selected in the fall was described. Size, number of kernels, weight, color, shape. 37 of the best ears. From those, they selected 20 for sowing, 17 in reserve. Keelan treated this as a sacred ritual. He stored the seeds in labeled linen pouches. He checked them every week. He sniffed them. He sorted through them, just as Daniel had taught him on his first day in the barn. Yaren wrote on paper she had brought from the caravan. Her notes were in 2 languages, in the Eastern language for herself and in the common language for Daniel. She systematized everything they had discussed over the winter. Fertilization methods, storage systems, principles of crop rotation. A comparative table of Eastern and Western approaches. Daniel looked at her work and thought that in his world, this would be a doctoral dissertation. Here, it was a birch bark notebook belonging to a 17-year-old girl in a merchant's tent. At the same time, he was preparing the people. It wasn't just knowledge that needed protecting. The people who carried that knowledge needed protecting. He gathered 20 students, those who attended the evening classes. He spoke with each one separately. He explained that a man from the capital would soon arrive, that this man would ask questions, and that these questions must be answered simply and honestly, without fear, without guile. Just tell the truth. What they did, what they received, what they saw with their own eyes. He didn't say the word inquisitor. He didn't want to scare them. He said inspector from the city. Halder knew better. After talking with Daniel, the village elder became gloomier than usual. He knew what an inquisitor was. He knew that the order's people didn't come just to talk, but he trusted Daniel. In a year and a half, this stranger had never once been wrong. Not once had he deceived him. If he said he could handle it, that meant there was a plan. Halder asked what the plan was. Daniel said the plan was simple. It was true. They would show the Inquisitor the fields. They would show him the harvest. They'd show him the records. They'd show him the children who weren't sick with scurvy. They'd show him the old people who'd survived 2 winters. And they'd say that they'd done all this with their own hands and minds, without witchcraft, without demons, without magic, just through work and observation. Halder was silent for a moment. Then he said that the truth doesn't always save you. Daniel replied that he knew, but lies never save you. April. Sowing. The 3rd season. Now the whole village was working. All 4 fields according to plan. Crop rotation, peas and barley, pure peas, turnips, clover on the fallow field. The southern field received a 2nd layer of compost. Daniel planned to conduct an experiment there with controlled flooding, following the scheme he and Yedin had developed over the winter. They let the spring floodwaters into the field through a system of ditches with sluice gates. The water stood for 3 days. It settled. It left a thin layer of silt. Then they drained it through the ditches into the stream. The field dried out in a week. The silt was gray and soft, rich in minerals, free fertilizer. Daniel stood at the edge of the field and smiled. Yedin stood beside him and smiled too. A small, reserved smile. Her smile. Daniel noticed that she only smiled when something worked, when theory is confirmed by practice, when the numbers add up. She wasn't happy because of praise or attention. She was happy that the world obeys understanding, that if you know how water, soil, and plants work, you can guide them in the right direction. It was a scientist's joy, pure and quiet. May. Han Dae-hyun's caravan began preparing to set out. The mountain passes had opened. The road was calling. Han Dae-hyun came to see Daniel. He said he was leaving in a week. He said he would return in the fall for the grain as agreed, and that he was leaving his daughter in Grayford. Daniel wasn't expecting this. He asked why. Han Dae-hyun said that Yerin had asked him to. She said she wanted to stay until fall, to finish her notes, to help with the experiments. Han Dae-hyun hesitated for a long time. Then he looked at his daughter, into her eyes, at the way she spoke about working with Daniel. And he realized that for the first time in her life, his daughter wanted something for herself. Not out of obedience, not out of duty. For herself. He agreed, but he left Shi-hyun with her, a guardian, a bodyguard, a living sword between Yedin and the world. Shi-hyun took the news without emotion. An order is an order. She stayed. The caravan left, 10 wagons, mules, horses, dust on the road. Yedin stood at the edge of town and watched them go. Her face was calm. Her hands clutched a notebook with her notes. She turned to Daniel and said they needed to finish the layout of the settling ponds before planting the southern field. Daniel nodded. They went to work. June arrived hot, and with it came Jun, not refugees, not merchants, 2 horsemen in gray cloaks with silver ears of grain on their clasps. They rode into Grayford at noon, quietly, without announcement. They stopped at the community house. The first dismounted, tall, thin, about 50 years old, an austere face, clear, attentive eyes, dry hands with long fingers, the hands of a man who writes a lot. The second was younger, an assistant. He was carrying a bag of papers. Halder stepped out to meet them. He bowed. The elder introduced himself, Father Malak, Inquisitor of the Order of the Grey Colossus. He had arrived to verify reports of non-canonical agricultural practices in the village of Grayford. His words were smooth, polite, like a sharpened knife. Daniel stood 3 steps behind Halder. He watched. Malak was not what he had imagined him to be. Not a fanatic with burning eyes. Not a dim-witted soldier. An educated man. Calm. Confident. A man who had come not to punish, but to understand, which was far more dangerous. You can out-argue a fanatic. With an intelligent person, you have to be honest. Malak looked at Daniel. Their eyes met. Malak tilted his head slightly, as if he had recognized something, or sensed it. Then he turned away and asked Halder to show him the village. The inspection began. Malak worked methodically. On the first day, he walked through the village with his assistant. He looked. He took notes. He didn't ask questions. He just watched. Daniel observed him from a distance. Malak stopped by the compost piles. He bent down. He sniffed. He took a handful, rubbed it between his fingers. He stood by the field of peas and barley. He stood there for a long time. He looked at the difference between the experimental and control plots. He approached the turnip beds. He touched the tops. He went into the storage shed. He counted the barrels. He opened the lids. He tasted the sauerkraut. He said nothing. On the evening of the first day, Malak asked Halder for a meeting. Halder called Daniel. The 3 of them sat in the community hall. Malak's assistant took notes. Malak started with the basics. He asked Halder how long the stranger had been in the village. Halder said 1.5 years. He asked where he had come from. Halder said he didn't know. He had just appeared in the field, wet, in strange clothes. He spoke their language but with a foreign accent. He asked what he did. Halder began to list his tasks. He sorted the grain. He dug a ditch. He showed them the compost. He planted peas with barley. He taught them how to make sauerkraut. He cured the children of gum disease. Halder spoke dryly. Facts. No emotion. Like a report. Malak listened. Then he turned to Daniel. He asked how he knew all this. Daniel said the same thing he told everyone, from his father and from his father's father. Generations of observing the land. Malak looked him in the eyes for a long time. Then he nodded. He didn't believe it, but he accepted it, for now. The second day, Malak asked to be shown the fields. Daniel led the way. He showed him a 4-field crop rotation. He explained each field: barley with peas, pure peas, turnips, clover. Malak listened. He didn't interrupt. When Daniel finished, he asked one question. He asked why peas help the barley. Daniel answered as he would have answered the villagers. Peas capture a force from the air that nourishes the soil, through their roots. Barley growing next to peas receives this force and grows better. Malak was silent for a moment. Then he said that the order's records mention that legumes improve the soil, that this had been known for a long time. Daniel froze. Malak said this calmly, like a fact, without a threat. But behind that fact lay an abyss. The order knew that legumes improve the soil, knew and remained silent. Daniel didn't react. He nodded, said he was glad his observations matched the records of wise men. Malak looked at him, smiled slightly, barely noticeably, like a man who had assessed his opponent's move in a chess game. The third day, Malak spoke with people, one at a time, in the community hall. The door was closed. An assistant took notes. Halder, Lena, Keelan, Maeve, Greta, the mother of the boy Daniel had cured of scurvy, 2 men from the group that had dug the first trench, Torvald. Each conversation lasted about an hour. Daniel didn't know what they were saying. He wasn't present. He walked through the fields and waited. His hands itched with restlessness. He was used to being in control, but here he couldn't be. Sihun found him by the southern field. She stood beside him, sharpening a knife, silently. Then she said that if the Inquisitor tried to take Daniel away, she would stop him. Daniel said there was no need, that a sword wouldn't solve this problem. Sihun said that a sword could solve any problem. The only question is whether you're ready for the consequences. Daniel looked at her. She was serious, absolutely serious. This woman was ready to kill the Inquisitor of the Order of the Grey Colossus if he laid a finger on the person she'd been ordered to protect. No, she hadn't been ordered. Han De-hyun had ordered her to protect Yurin, and Daniel just happened to be inside that same circle, because Yurin was right next to him, and Shi-hyun was protecting the entire circle. Daniel said thank you. Shi-hyun shrugged and left. Day 4. Malak asked to see the records. Daniel brought everything. Lena's birch bark notebooks, Keelan's breeding records, field diagrams, yield tables, comparative data for 2 seasons. Malak read for 3 hours. His assistant sat nearby and copied down selected passages. Malak read in silence. Sometimes he went back to previous pages. He compared the numbers. He checked. Daniel sat across from him and waited. When Malak finished, he looked up. His face was strange, not hostile, not suspicious, thoughtful. He asked Daniel who had taught him to keep records this way, systematically, with control groups, with repeatable observations. Daniel said it was just a habit. If you want to know the truth, you have to record and compare. Otherwise, you'll deceive yourself. Malak was silent. Then he said something strange. He said that 300 years ago, one man kept records exactly the same way, systematic, with numbers, with control plots. His name was Thomas of Ellsberg. Silence. Daniel didn't move. He didn't breathe. Thomas of Ellsberg. A name. It was the first time he'd heard the name. He asked quietly what had happened to Thomas. Malach said that Thomas had been declared a heretic and burned. His notes had been confiscated, sealed, hidden in the order's archives. Daniel asked why. Malach said it was because the notes were dangerous, not to the faith, to the order. A long of silence. Malach looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Malach. Between them was a silence that spoke louder than words. Malach knew. He knew that Daniel's methods worked. He knew that Thomas had done the same thing 300 years ago. He knew that the order had deliberately suppressed this knowledge, and he had come not because he believed in heresy. He had come because he had been ordered to, and he was a man who followed orders, but he was also a man who knew how to think. Daniel made up his mind. He asked directly. He asked if it was true that Thomas's methods had worked. Malach was silent for a long time. Then he said one word. Yes. Daniel asked if his methods worked. Malach was silent again. Then he said that the fields spoke for themselves. Daniel asked what he would write in the report. Malach stood up. He gathered his papers. He said he would write the truth. He didn't specify what truth. He left on the 6th day, quietly, in the morning, without goodbyes. He left Halder a document bearing the order's seal, permission to continue agricultural practices in the village of Greyford, temporary, for 1 year, with the caveat that a reinspection would be conducted. Daniel read the paper and his hands were shaking. A year. Malach had given him a year. Not out of kindness, out of doubt. The Inquisitor had begun to doubt the system he served. Daniel knew this wasn't a victory. It was a respite. But a respite was time, and time was the only thing he needed. The summer of the 2nd year proved to be a turning point. After Malach's departure, something changed not only in Greyford, but also in the surrounding area. Rumors of a village that had received the order's permission spread faster than those of a village that wasn't starving. Permission meant legitimacy. It meant that the outsider wasn't a sorcerer, that his methods were tested and approved, even if only temporarily, even with reservations, but accepted nonetheless. In July, the village elders from 3 neighboring villages arrived. Not together, one at a time, a week apart. Each came alone, without an entourage, quietly, like a supplicant. The first was from the village of Mosfen, a small man with shifty eyes. He stood before Halder, wringing his cap in his hands. He said that in Mosfen, out of 40 households, 26 remained, that 11 children had died that winter, that last year's harvest was next to nothing, that if next year was the same, the village would cease to exist. Halder looked at Daniel. Daniel nodded. Let him come to learn. 10 men from Mosfen can spend a week in Greyford. They'll see the fields. They'll see the compost. They'll see the drainage. They'll be shown and told. In return, Mosfen will give Greyford 5 extra hands for the fall harvest. Knowledge for labor. Fair enough. The second village elder came from Coldwood, a larger village, 60 households, but the same problems: depleted soil, monoculture, famine. The third was from Heinberg, 45 households, same story. Daniel welcomed them all. Kalen became the teacher. At 17, he stood before grown men from other villages and explained what crop rotation was and why compost was needed. He spoke confidently, clearly, in his own words. He didn't parrot Daniel like a parrot. He understood the essence and translated it into a language the peasants could understand. Daniel listened to him and felt pride, a strange kind, a fatherly one. He had never had children. Kalen wasn't his son. But what he saw was a birth, the birth of a man who would carry knowledge forward. Aiden was teaching too. She was showing women from neighboring villages how to ferment vegetables, how to brew rosehip tea, how to tell by the appearance of plants what was missing in the soil. Her herbarium was growing. Already 40 entries, with the drawings Yedin made. Delicate, precise brushstrokes. Every leaf, every root, every flower. Yedin drew as she breathed, effortlessly, with natural precision. Daniel watched these four: Kaylin, Lena, Aiden, Yedin. 4 people who, just 2 years ago, didn't know that the earth could feed them in a different way. Now they were teaching others. The network. Knowledge spread like ripples on water. He couldn't be everywhere, but he could be nowhere, and the system kept working. That was more important than any harvest. August. Shihyun came to Daniel with a proposal. She said that if the neighboring villages were now allies, they needed to be protected. Not just from hunger, from bandits, from deserters, from lords who might decide that 3 villages with a good harvest were easy prey. Daniel knew she was right. He had been putting it off, didn't want to think about war. But Shihyun was right. A well-fed village in a starving world was a target. He asked her to draw up a plan. Shihyun perked up. For the first time since she'd been in Greyford, genuine interest appeared in her eyes. Not boredom, not patience, interest. Over the course of a week, she surveyed the surrounding area. She studied the approaches to the village. She found a spot for an observation post on a hill. She found narrow passages between the hills where 5 could hold off 50. And she proposed to Daniel a plan for a fortified redoubt. Not walls around the village. Walls were too expensive and time-consuming. A redoubt. A fortified point on a hill where people and livestock could be taken in case of an attack. An earthen rampart. A palisade. A supply of water and food. A watchtower. Daniel looked at the plan. He knew nothing about fortifications, but he knew how to organize the work. He asked how many people and how much time. Sihyun said 20 men, 3 weeks. Daniel went to Halder. He explained. Halder didn't argue. He had survived the winter when a band of robbers raided 3 farms and killed a man. He knew that protection was needed. They built it in September after the harvest. 20 men and Sihyun, who commanded them with the cold clarity of a professional warrior. At first, the men didn't listen to her. A woman, a stranger, small, even with a sword. Sihyun didn't shout. She didn't threaten. She simply picked up a shovel and, in an hour, dug a section of the rampart smoother and deeper than any of them could. Exclusive videos, story continuations, and bonus content are already available on Patreon before YouTube, so check the link in the description for early access to all new recaps and continuations.